Thursday, August 22nd, 2024. Let's take a look at the headlines making waves in the Nigerian dailies, beginning with Daily Trust. The bolder headline says, airstrikes killed 5 Boko Haram commanders in Borno, says the NAF. You can turn to page 4 of the paper to get the full story. And below the nameplate, Kano Anti-Graft Agency probes 660 million naira fresh water contract scam. You can turn to page 3 of the paper. And on page 19, federal government targets $100 billion investment, 2 million jobs from creative economy. And beside that, new northern group to meet leaders over region's problems. Beside the picture, PDP crisis. If I open up, it won't be pleasant, says Damagum. Turn to page 11 of the paper to get the full story. And on page 6, Ribadu El Rufai Tambuwal meets at Atiku's residence in Abuja. And the federal government hikes passport fees. You can turn to page 6 of the paper to get the full story. Abducted Sokoto district head dies in captivity. That story is found on page 26 of the paper. Away from that, let's take you to The Guardian, where the bolder headline says, echoes of cabinet reshuffle trail minister's performance a year after. You can turn to page 6 of the paper to get the full story. Below the picture on the news page 2, experts urge diplomacy as Chinese firm lists country's assets for sale. Nigeria to begin revocation of dormant oil well licenses. You can turn to the news page 29 of The Guardian for the full story. Wike Damagum defend standpoint as PDP Rivers crisis fester. The news story is found on page 6 of the paper. Stakeholders set agenda for Kekere Ekun new CJN. Can turn to page 3 of the paper to get the full story. And also on page 3, Arabambi alleges plot by Ajaero to spark civil unrest. And below that, tough times ahead as subsidy shaves 7.7 trillion naira of FAAC allocations. Can turn to the business page 15 of The Guardian to get the full story. And on the panorama page 2, Tinubu has mortgaged Nigeria's future to family, friends, says Atiku. Away from The Guardian, let's take a look at Vanguard, where the bolder headline says, petrol scarcity worsens as marketers load at 780 naira per litre. You can turn to the news page 20 of the paper to get the full story. And above the nameplate, food inflation reducing will reduce it further, says the finance minister. Turn to page 19 of the paper for the story. End bad governance. CSOs berate the federal government over prolonged detention of protesters without charges. Can turn to page 6 to get the full story. And on page 15, federal government increases international passport fees. And beside that, on page 9, police invitation to Ajaero. More critical unions give strike notices. And below the picture, federal government finally criminalizes vandalism of telecom facilities in new gazette. You can turn to page 26 of the paper to get the full story. And on page 16, Nigeria made Dangote a colossus. It must now handle him wisely, says Olu Fason. And on sports page 31, Sports Minister dangles 24 million naira cash reward for gold medalists. And before we go, fake certificates, Uganda, Kenya, right JAMB, demand students verification. You can turn to page 9 of the paper to get the full story. Away from that, let's take a look at the Nigerian Tribune, where the bolder headline says, Rivers crisis. Damagun opens up a controversial letter to the appeal court. You can turn to page 3 of the paper to get the full story. And above the nameplate, withdraw invitation to Ajaero, opposition lawmakers tell the police. You can turn to page 3 of the paper to get the full story. And on page 6, $500 million domestic bond, investors' rights to assets, funds protected under law, says Edun. And beside the picture, Nigeria needs new mapping to address insecurity, says surveyors. You can turn to page 13 of the paper to get the full story. And on page 11, alleged drug purchase scandal, Kwankwaso, Algon chairman, permanent secretary arrested. Enugu government demolishes kidnappers' den, says more to go down. Non-release of new minimum wage, consequential adjustments causing anxiety, says Labour. You can turn to page 11 of the Nigerian Tribune to get the full story. Let's move over to Business Day, where the border headline says Nigeria's rusty foreign exchange market struggles to crank. You can turn to page 31 of the paper to get the full story. And on page 31 also, cargo piles as aircraft shortage delays delivery. And on page 6, demand for PTA, school fees for dollar scarcity in parallel market. Telecoms cable vandals face jail term in new law. You can turn to page 30 of the paper to get the full story. And also on page 30, dollar bond, Edun assures investors of asset safety. That's all we'll be looking at from the headlines making waves in the Nigerian dailies. If any of this headline caught your attention, do well to get a copy of the paper and read the full story on the identified pages.